So in our next panel, we're going to shift to NFTs. We've got a great group of people. I'm going to let them come up this way, and I'll come up this way. And we have Brian Cho from Patron, who served as a partner at A16Z and has been investing in games and Riot Games and operating for many years. We have Francesco Malpignano, who is the head of the Kadena Eco, who's doing grants, who has a lot of ideas. Also, small note about Francesco, this was his second option career. He was going to be a professional golfer. It's true, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess this was a better choice.
And we have Lee Zhang. They just referenced him in the last session. He is building out a platform called Spaceport, which just is the coolest name. And they're managing IP on the blockchain for NFTs. And Andra Nicolau, who is going to moderate for us. And she probably knows every major investor because she has raised a lot of money for the places like 1inch and now Origin Protocol. So I think she has a lot of background knowledge that she can help moderate this with. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Is this mic on? Okay, I think it's on now. Can you guys hear me okay? Yay. Awesome. NFTs, how many of you own NFTs? Hands up. All right, we got a good audience. That's awesome. Sweet. So I work at Origin Protocol, and we have two sides of the business. We have the NFT side, which is absolutely crushing it. We've had some record-breaking NFT sales with like SpaceX, Paris Hilton, Blau, and so on. I work on the DeFi side of the business. I grow our OUSD, which is Origin Dollar yield-bearing stablecoin. So I'm actually a skeptic when it comes to NFTs, even though I work for an NFT company that's, like I said, crushing it. So I'm really, really excited to hear a little bit more from our panelists today. So that being said, let's get started with some questions. What are some interesting use cases for NFTs today?
I would consider myself relatively new to the Web3 ecosystem. I just got started last fall, just founded a new company recently in the last few months, and started investing myself into NFTs in December of last year. But that just means I've taken a deep dive into all of the different aspects of NFTs. And I think
there's three elements that I think the value in NFTs boils down to, and it's exclusivity, collectability, and utility. And so just a few personal experiences of mine over the last few months with NFTs that I owned. One of them is in Azuki, which is one of the blue chip NFT collections. It's anime-inspired profile pictures. But they give you access to some in-person events, such as the one that was hosted in NFT NYC. And just recently, I was in Okinawa for another conference, and I bumped into a board director at a major gaming studio. And even though we had a language barrier, we had both gone to this one exclusive event. We were able to bond over that event. And that's something that I wouldn't have experienced if I didn't own that NFT. So I think that was a very interesting use case of the exclusivity of an NFT.
No, I think I completely agree with Lei. It feels like it's like the earliest innings of this technology, right, in terms of where we're at. And I think like the most obvious applications today are what you see on social media, whether it's profile pics or NFT art, which I think have really taken off in the last year or so. But I think if we look back on what sparked this NFT summer in the last 18 months, it's really products like NBA Top Shot, and I guess today it's talked about a lot in the media, but play to earn gaming as relates to like Axie Infinity and such. So yeah, it feels like a lot of the consumer applications are going to be what drives NFT adoption, and it's probably more products that are like Top Shot and Axie that gets regular consumers onboarded, and it's just easier to understand. I mean, y'all come from different parts of Web3, whether it's DeFi or on the protocol side, but I think that the powerful thing about NFTs is just really easy for most folks to understand. When you have a virtual good that's ownable, that's tradable, there's obviously a lot of culture that's baked into it. So people show off their Bored Apes on their profile pics, or they have different ways to use it, whether it's music or gaming. So I'm curious to get all your opinions, but it feels like a lot of what's driving NFT growth and why it's exciting is because of the consumer application. Whereas I think with a lot of other things in Web3, it's not as obvious, or it's not as mainstream as what we're dealing with today on the NFT side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happening right now is, all the use cases that are popular today, i.e. selling JPEGs online, it's really just scratching the surface of what this technology promises. I think it's important to take a step back even and think like, what does non-fungible even mean? Right? It's not even really a word. Like being fungible is a word. So what does that mean? Like non-fungible is pretty much everything else in the world. So it's a technology that can represent any sort of value that we can create in the world, whether it's physical or digital, and put that on a blockchain and actually like drive digital value that it's long lasting. And the use cases are really endless, and we're just scratching the surface. Now with JPEGs, we're moving to sort of NFTs 2.0, things with utility, things that start to make more and more sense as our lives become more and more digital.
Okay, so speaking of use cases, we know where we are today, but where are we going? What are some interesting, durable use cases for the future?
So I'll start again. I picture a future where the open metaverse is a daily element to our lives, right? One specific use case I think about is augmented reality. Right? So I think that in our lifetimes, we're going to see some advanced augmented reality goggles that we'll be able to wear on a daily basis. And we're going to see physical screens and physical assets start to convert over to digital screens and assets that are then pinned. You might be at home, instead of watching your TV, you have a virtual screen that's pinned to your TV. And instead of a Monet on your wall, you might have a Fidenza that's virtually pinned on that wall. Right? So I think naturally over time, you're going to see this transfer of physical assets into digital assets. And what better representation of the ownership of digital assets than NFTs? And so we're going to see more and more use cases for NFTs as applied to our day-to-day lives because of this integration of augmented reality, virtual reality, and the open metaverse as a whole.
Yeah, I'm bullish on actual reality. And I think like what will happen in the NFT space is we'll see a lot of business models that make sense in the physical world today move to its digitally native version. Because what we see right now, that's all these business models that were made on the internet are not actually digitally native assets. So like the next use case or the next applications of NFTs can go anywhere that, like I was saying before, anywhere that sort of the mind can take, and use cases that make sense, business models that make sense in the physical world. Like for example, NFTs can be a next sort of paradigm for fundraising, because today, like if you start a company, coming up with tokenomics before you have a product, before you know which direction the stuff is going, it's actually a pretty hard feat, right? And you see that people can have baggage from getting tokenomics wrong at the start. So something that you can do with NFTs is something that happens in the real world today, which is potentially represent share classes at a startup. Someone can invest, they can come in, and then buy different types of share classes, whether that's founding shares or investor shares or common stock, and then that use case makes sense because A, you can fundraise, and also it can serve as a fundamental hierarchical structure of governing a DAO, right? Because then that's who gets the votes, what's the hierarchy in this company, and that's also like the other use case that DAOs do need to move off of the one token, one vote sort of paradigm, because that's historically never worked on this planet for good governance.
Yeah, I think I agree. You gotta think what's working today. I mean, a lot of us can probably guess what's gonna happen in the future, but I think the most obvious use case that is working today that seems to be taking off is around the art use case, specifically generative art. So, pre-NFTs, like when you create digital art, I mean, it's like literally a JPEG. People can, right-click Save As, like it's tough to see the provenance of that artwork, like who created it, and obviously there's not value tied to it because it's not, bound to a token. So, people could literally share as much as they wanted to, but I think, aside from like the speculative nature and all that, like the most interesting thing about NFT art is actually it helps a lot of these artists that typically didn't have ways to either raise funds or make a means of living to be able to create these digital assets in art. So I think one thing that folks sleep on, and it's certainly like one of the killer use cases of NFT today is, I don't know if y'all are familiar with this project called Art Blocks. It's one of the biggest digital artworks that curate like some of the best artists that are in the NFT space. But there's actually a 2.5% royalty that happens every time an artwork is transacted, and it goes back to the artist. So as an artist, you could create this beautiful piece of work that, essentially for the rest of your life and beyond, if you do create the next water lilies or the next starry nights, you're going to be able to capture that royalty as that time goes on. And I think aside from the royalties, there's ways to track the provenance, the authenticity, as you know, in the art market. Fraud and people just basically creating fake artwork is a huge thing. It actually helps solve for that. So, personally, our fund is really interested in where NFT is going as it relates to open metaverse and what have you. But it feels like today, some of the most obvious use cases are on the generative art use case.
And what about the future? What do you think would be some interesting ones in the future?
Yeah, I think if you extrapolate out, just if you think art is the most basic primitive of what NFTs can be, for me, coming from gaming, where I spent the last 10 years working with virtual items, and especially in the gaming space, gaming today is what $100 billion industry, and a good chunk of that actually comes from virtual goods and assets. The model today is effectively you're renting these goods from these game developers. I don't know if I tweeted about this a while ago, or recently, Vitalik's origin story is he created Ethereum because he was super sad that Blizzard, the game developer, nerfed his virtual item and felt like there was no recourse as it relates to owning those things, right? So I think in the future, if you do believe we're going to spend more time virtually and in this world, and there's going to be jobs that's going to happen online, and there's ways to earn, it just feels like it makes more sense that there's going to be virtual assets that you can own, that you can. It creates, membership, the stuff that you talked about, Francesco, and all the way to what Lei's talked about, which is, I think, with VR and AR, there are certainly interesting applications as these virtual assets. If you think about NFTs as a resource today that we just discovered, let's compare it to oil. We're literally putting that oil in a barrel, and that's the use case today, right? But as you know, with that resource, over time, it turned into different chemicals. You're able to build plastic, the use cases for it just ended up being something very different, and I just think that's where we're at today. Today it's tough to guess where this new resource is going to go, but what we do know is some of the smartest people, whether it's in Silicon Valley or just in technology in general, and that's why we're investing in Web3. They are doubling down in this space, and it just feels as an investor, it's a space you have to focus on, just given the wealth of talent that's going into the space today.
Very cool. And how early are we?
Super early. I mean, I think just to lead off what Brian was saying, one approach is seeing NFTs and blockchain technologies as this basic primary element that you can just create more and more technologies off of. And then, and that's really important, but also at the same time is to think about what are all the big problems that we face in the world today that are growing increasingly more important, and then how do the two intersect? And I think that, like Brian said, just scratching the surface right now. Because if you look at how complex our physical world is, and for instance, NFTs representing digital assets, right? Looking at physical assets in the real world, I see some cans of soda in the audience right now. And when you go to the store and you buy that can of soda, I mean, I guess you could say that you own that can of soda. You can take it home, you can put it on your counter. You own that one can, you can drink its contents. But at the end of the day, how much of that can actually do you own? Right? You don't own the logo on that can. You don't even own the fonts on that can. All of those logos, fonts, images, those were licensed out to the manufacturer in order to produce that can. You don't own the patent behind the construction of that can itself or the tab on the top. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of pieces of ownership that goes into creating the products that we use on a day-to-day basis in the real world right now. And if you take a look at digital assets, it's very simple, right? There might be an artist creating a piece of art. They might own the copyright. They might give you a license to use that copyright, and then you own the art. But the complexity is not quite there yet. Right? So that's where, for me and my project here at Spaceport, enabling the concept of licensing, enable the remixing, and for multiple different parties to collaborate together on a final product, that's where we think long-term NFTs are going to head, and it's going to take some time to get to that point.
Yeah, it feels like we're not, I'll kind of take the other side, which to say, I feel like we're not that early in NFTs, right? Like, I think when you go ask somebody on the street about like DeFi or like what's happening with a lot of other things in crypto, like it feels like conceptually it's really tough to understand, but you know, like with products like Top Shot, like if you watch like the NBA finals, like people actually joke about somebody being an NFT because they got dunked on, right? Like it's become more of like a mainstream culture thing, and you look at, you know, most recently, like the Bored Ape company, Yuga Labs, which is one of our portfolio companies, they threw a concert with Snoop Dogg and Eminem at NFT NYC. And, you know, like the fact that they're creating music videos around these like assets where like, you know, literally a year ago, like people were laughing at these things for like, you know, being like ugly JPEGs. And now it's like more culturally accepted and, you know, it's being fueled by people using it on social media as their profile pictures. It feels like, you know, I will take the other stance and say like it doesn't feel that early, and it actually feels, if anything, like just super exciting to be able to build on.
That's awesome. I saw Fred there. You agreed.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, it's in the reality. Snoop
Well,
Dogg.
actually, I'm going to have to take the contrarian stance here. I think we're too early. Do we have any OpenSea investors in here? No? Okay, great. Well, if you were, you did not invest in a crypto company. That's how early we are. OpenSea is really something like an eBay that happens to sell crypto goods. The business model behind it, and maybe that's why it was so popular with investors, is actually a lot more like a Web2 company. I don't think that we're seeing the sort of real use cases, real potential, and sort of the next applications that will actually drive mainstream adoption coming to the space.
Very cool. Anything you want to add to that? All right, I think we have like 2.5 minutes for questions if anyone has anything. Go ahead.
So out of a lot of the trends that have driven crypto, like the ICOs, we've seen companies like Binance and others like, kind of emerge as the earlier winners. I think we'd all agree that OpenSea has taken a lot of the capital space right now in NFTs, but we're in the middle of a kind of transition point to seeing more of those emerging winners or large companies with staying power. Are there any people in the space you'd point to that are on a similar track that you think we'll see in the next few years still heavy in the space?
Yeah, it feels like Uniswap is one of these companies, right? Like if you look at the usage statistic of Uniswap for every like crypto Web3 user, like I believe last stat I looked at, it was like above 50%, which is insane. And to Francesco's point, it's actually decentralized, like it's a protocol that in a lot of ways replaces these like centralized exchanges of like Web2. So that might be just like one obvious company that's just going to crush it. It might be like what Google search was to Web 1 in terms of like how they dominate and they're able to get scale.
Yeah, I'll take the contrarian position on the OpenSea comment. I think it is, or I'd be curious on why. So the A16Z report really highlights this on the take rates, right? From Facebook is 100%, YouTube is 70, 80. And then you get down to OpenSea, and the take rate is 2.5%. So this is, for creators, this is a massive change. So I'd be curious on why, and I'm not an OpenSea investor, but why that's not a market difference for creators.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as simple as looking at the tech stack. What Web3 promises is decentralized access to data, decentralized access, that anyone can query Ethereum and get the relevant things that they need from it. If you look at OpenSea, it's actually a Web 2 model. Like something like even Twitter profile pictures, they use an OpenSea API. That's kind of totally against all the premises of what we've been promised and been promising for Web 3 itself. It's taking back stuff that's supposed to be decentralized and turning it into a centralized service. I don't think it makes sense in the long-term context of what we're trying to do with the technology.
Yeah, I personally love OpenSea. I use it a lot. I think to just go off of Francesco's thoughts, one issue that I do have with that platform is, what happens on that platform is if you buy a NFT that was like hacked or stolen, it effectively becomes frozen, even though it's in your wallet. So what that means is like, let's say you paid, 100 ETH for like a Bored Ape, and you didn't know, but a few months later, like this flag shows up on your wallet or on the OpenSea site saying that this asset has been stolen. You effectively can't trade it on OpenSea. And I think as a centralized entity that has that kind of like say or power over what's supposed to be decentralized, what's supposed to be yours, it's tough, right? And there's been a lot of complaints about it. I actually think there's even like lawsuits and what have you. So that's probably one element of an NFT that a downside of a centralized platform that deals with decentralized assets like NFTs.
Yeah, one quick thing I'd like to add there is that I'm not saying that NFT is not going to be, that OpenSea is not going to be here to stay, because everyone knows that marketplaces are pretty much the hardest business model to pull off. But I think that it does need to evolve and provide the promise of Web3 of actually decentralized access to data.
The final thing I was going to add is I do think they're moving in the right direction with their recent swap over to the Seaport protocol that they helped develop, which is a decentralized series of smart contracts that are replacing some of their centralized services. So I think they are moving in the right direction.
Amazing.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of like the OpenSea APIs and like being used for Twitter verification. I'm curious to see what alternative you see in the space, because from my understanding, the reason everyone uses OpenSea's APIs is because they have the best indexer, because there's no standardization on the metadata level for NFTs. So how do you see that being developed and pushed forward to a decentralized future?
On Ethereum node. It's where you can query Ethereum directly.
Yeah, but the issue is you can query the Ethereum and the metadata, but that doesn't mean you can produce the JPEG, right? Because like that's, from my understanding, even like Coinbase NFT marketplace was delayed for months because they were trying to not use OpenSea's API and build out their own indexer to produce the front end image, and that's pretty, like from a technical standpoint, a pretty big limitation to having a decentralized access.
Of course, and it's not an easy feat to pull this stuff off. So it's something that's sort of the next frontier of the technology is to provide actually decentralized services. So you can think of all sorts of services that could live, whether it's on your own front end or on AWS, that could parse this data that's coming from the chain, and you could query this data from not a fully centralized endpoint.
Yeah, I think it's you got to take steps towards that fully decentralized future, right? And so there's more and more services that are now fully decentralized or heading in that direction. And then now APIs are a bottleneck for apps, decentralized apps that are building off of the Infura or the Alchemy APIs or the OpenSea APIs. And so what are the next steps that need to be taken in order to decentralize those services and provide broader access to developers and users? That's a question for builders.
I have time for one super quick one.
I had a question. So NFTs beyond JPEGs, and admittedly, I own a lot of JPEGs, have flipped a lot of JPEGs, have fun with a lot of JPEGs, but I know that there's like life beyond that, right? And I think the one thing we were talking about earlier is the other forms of art that have entered this space but have been met with a lot of resistance, right? Photography, music, fine art. Recently invested in the Goda project, which you guys are probably familiar with. Nina Chanel now coming on board. Her project fell flat. And so where do you guys see the shift happening where other NFT art projects beyond JPEGs become more acceptable and become more mainstream, like the Bored Apes, like the Azukis, like the Doodles, et cetera?
Yeah. Since I spent a lot of time in this space, I'll just jump in really quick. But I think when you're an external brand trying to enter NFTs, it's a lot harder, because today a lot of the users, as you know, are crypto natives, people that have MetaMask, people that are into this kind of budding culture. I think you just kind of face a lot of resistance from just folks that are probably in this ecosystem. And I think it's literally what happened with the early internet, where a lot of the people it's kind of like people scanning a newspaper and uploading to the web, right? Versus actually creating new sites. And I think a lot of the NFT artists that are going to do well are the ones that just really lean into the generative art that has embraced what makes crypto interesting, right? Whether it's creating a interesting burn mechanism or how the NFT can evolve. So my perspective is I think the winners in this space are going to be probably projects and startups and builders that come from crypto and Web3, and that's going to be the case for artists, the case for game developers, and the case for just a lot of people in general that are building from scratch. So I'd personally be more biased towards, thinking that's like the future versus a lot of the other folks that have established brands that are trying to come in and, build, try to force kind of like what's worked in the past. And, people use the word skeuomorphic, but that's where I kind of think about, where that use case is today.
And just to add to that, I think it's also about community building, right? In more traditional arts, I think there is a distance between the art and the artist that the more you enforce it, the more covetable or desirable the art is. Whereas NFTs are all about community and getting everyone excited about what you're building, connecting with them. Even the most established brands like Chanel, Ally, etc., they were allergic to social media for the longest. It's like, we don't want to connect with our audience. We want them to see us as untouchable, and that's what allows us to make these items so expensive. But over time, you see the pressure to connect with that audience. And I think that's what happens with NFTs as well. You're going to have these photographers that don't necessarily want to connect and don't want to create this hype around their project in order to make it desirable for people to buy it.
How do you feel about the rise of democratized marketplaces moving away from high creator royalty fees, like 5 to 7% on maybe Magic Eden or OpenSea? Do you think it's good for consumers getting more back, or does it limit teams too much?
I think royalties are good as long as it's going to the creator and not to like a centralized marketplace, because the reason why we're building on Web3, and Francesco touched on this, is like the idea that you don't have a middle person that's controlling like the transaction, and it should be permissionless. And the take rate, personally I think 10% is too much, even compared to like a 30% of like a traditional app store. It feels like that's where the world's headed, and I think what is important though is what I described earlier, which is like the artists, they get their take, right? That's what makes the space interesting. That's what's going to cause more artists to want to come into this space and be able to create new NFTs and digital assets. So it just feels like that's where the world is headed. But today we're kind of in this world where it is early, right? We just have to deal with this transition period, and I think you'll see products move away from being super centralized to what you described as decentralized.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in that respect, it's a free market. When a creator, an artist, whoever it is, mints their NFT, they should be able to define whatever rules make sense in the context of their project. Not to beat on a dead horse, but I think it's ridiculous that centralized entities today need to control things such as royalties. That's certainly, I think, something that's not in the long-term vision of where this technology is going.
And origin story, at Origin we do take fees, but 100% of those go back to the community, to OGN holders. So we think that that's a much fairer model.
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to the incentives for creators to create interesting content, right? And that's going to be a market that discovers itself. It might be too low right now, right? So creators might need 20% in order to feel like they're incentivized to create interesting content, but at least they have the free market to be able to say, I can set my rate and see what happens when I put my art out there.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Andra.